You owe us your salary. Dad screamed when I refused to fund my sister's shopping sprees and luxury vacations. They filed for financial oversight, claiming I was mentally unfit in court. I dropped a DNA bombshell. I'm not even their biological child. The judge called it fraud, and I walked free. While they faced federal charges for identity theft and financial abuse. I'm 26 meters, a software engineer working in Boston. I've been on my own since I was 21. But my story really begins 2 months ago when my father screamed those exact words at me. You owe us your salary. His voice ran through my phone so loud I had to hold it away from my ear. It wasn't even the worst part. He wasn't talking about bills or some emergency. He wanted me to send my entire monthly salary to my younger sister, Iva, a 24-year-old spoiled princess who had already burned through 2 trust funds on designer shopping sprees and luxury vacations, all while living rent-free at our parents' house and treating everyone like an inconvenience. It started off as a polite request. Eva needed money for her upcoming trip to Europe and a new wardrobe. I said no, clearly and calmly. I had just finished paying off my student loans and was finally saving to buy my own apartment. But somehow my refusal turned into a family war. My mother didn't call me, but my dad did every day, escalating from guilt trips to full-on threats. You're selfish. You wouldn't have that job if we hadn't raised you. We made you who you are. We deserve this. The phone calls became increasingly unhinged. My father would call at all hours. 6 a.m. before work, during my lunch breaks. Sometimes as late as midnight, he'd start calm, almost reasonable, then escalate into screaming rants about family obligation and respect. My mother would occasionally grab the phone to add her own guilt trips, reminding me of every sacrifice they claimed to have made, every dollar they said they'd spend on my upbringing. The manipulation was sophisticated and relentless. They'd alternate between different tactics. Sometimes it was pure anger and demands. Other times it was vague concern about my selfish tendencies and how I was losing my way. They brought up childhood memories, twisted to support their narrative that I had always been ungrateful and difficult. They even claimed that my success in tech was somehow their achievement, that without their guidance and support, I never would have made it through college. Eva herself never called me directly, but I could hear her in the background during these conversations, adding her own commentary about how I was being and how I was ruining her life by not helping with her expenses. The entitlement was breathtaking. She genuinely seemed to believe that my salary existed primarily to fund her lifestyle. Then one day I got a letter from a lawyer. My parents had filed a petition claiming I was financially irresponsible and requesting court-appointed financial oversight on the basis that I was making poor financial decisions and needed professional guidance with them as my recommended advisors. I laughed at first. I honestly thought it was some kind of bluff. But when the court date arrived in the mail, the panic set in. They were serious. The worst part, they brought character witnesses. People from my childhood church, neighbors who hadn't spoken to me in years, even an old teacher, all claiming I'd always been troubled and unstable. It was like being gaslit by my entire past. I hired a lawyer. A good one. When he saw the paperwork and statements, he told me something didn't add up. There were weird inconsistencies in the documents. Financial statements that claimed debts I didn't have. References to counseling sessions I'd never attended. And employment records that didn't match my actual job history. That's when I knew this wasn't just about Eva. This was about something bigger. So I did something I'd never thought I'd do. I got a paternity test done privately through my lawyer. Call it a hunch. But for years, I felt like an outsider in my own family. My parents were distant with me, but overly indulgent with Eva. There was a weird tension between my dad and mom. Anytime I asked questions about my childhood. And when I was 16, I overheard my mother saying she'd never forgiven my dad for what happened back then. At the time, I didn't understand it. Now I wondered if there was more to my parentage than I knew. The court date arrived and I walked in prepared. Lawyer at my side. Evidence in a thick folder and a sealed paternity results tucked securely in my briefcase. The courtroom was small, but the tension was suffocating. My parents sat across from me, smug, confident, backed by their character witnesses. Eva was there, too, smirking like she was already planning her next vacation. Their lawyer spoke first, arguing that I needed financial oversight for my own protection. He presented their fabricated evidence of my supposed instability. Then my lawyer stood up. He systematically dismantled their falsified documents, showed my actual financial records, proving responsible money management, and then dropped the bomb. Your Honor, we have evidence that fundamentally challenges the petitioner's legal standing in this matter. There was a silence that hung in the air like a dropped hammer. My father turned pale. My mother looked like she'd been struck. Eva looked confused. The judge accepted the sealed paternity results into evidence. My lawyer handed them over, and I could see the judge's eyes scanning the document. It only took a moment. Mr. Carter, the judge said, addressing my father. According to this paternity test, you are not the biological father of the young man you're seeking to control. Is this correct? I nodded when the judge looked at me. This fundamentally changes the nature of this petition you filed for financial oversight of an adult to whom you have no parental relationship while concealing this material. Fact from the court. My father tried to speak, but the judge held up a hand. This appears to be fraud perpetrated against both this court and Mr. Keating. The judge had court that my real last name wasn't Carter. This petition is dismissed immediately, and I'm ordering an investigation into how this case was brought forward with false premises. I stared at my father. He didn't deny it. He didn't even flinch. My mother just sat there, silent, defeated. Eva looked, lost. Their case collapsed instantly. I walked out of that courtroom with my dignity intact and my freedom. I should have felt victorious, but I felt hollow. I had spent my whole life trying to earn their approval. And now I found out the man I called father had no biological connection to me. I got back to my apartment that night and just sat on the floor. No calls, no texts, not even an apology. But that was just the beginning. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived. My parents were demanding I pay them back for raising someone else's child. A handwritten letter from my father was enclosed, stating that since I was never truly a son, I owed them 26 years of expenses. His words were venomous. You lived off our charity for decades. Time to pay it back. I laughed out loud. Then I cried. Then I realized I needed to find out who I really was. The paternity test had been processed through a lab that offered extended family matching services for an additional fee. They could compare my DNA profile to their database and potentially identify biological relatives. I paid for the comprehensive analysis and waited. 2 weeks later, I got results that changed everything. I had a close DNA match, a first cousin match that led to identification of my biological father, Daniel Keating, age 52, a software architect living in Vermont. The lab explained that Daniel had submitted his DNA 18 months earlier as part of a family genealogy project. I stared at the name for days before I worked up the courage to reach out. The testing company had a secure messaging system for connecting relatives. I sent a careful message explaining that I believe we might be related and asking if he'd be willing to discuss it. He responded within hours. Yes, he remembered a brief relationship with a married woman named Linda Carter 27 years ago. He'd wondered what happened when she suddenly ended contact, claiming her husband had found out he never knew she'd gotten pregnant. He was stunned to learn he had a son and wanted to meet immediately. I drove to Vermont the next Sunday, hands shaking on the steering wheel. Daniel opened the door and I could see my own eyes looking back at me. We sat in his kitchen for hours, filling in the gaps of a story that finally made sense. He'd met Linda at a professional conference when she claimed to be separated from her husband. They had a brief relationship before she ended it abruptly, saying she was trying to reconcile with her spouse. She never told him she was pregnant. When I was born, Linda had convinced her husband, Robert, that the baby was his. Despite the timeline not quite matching up. Robert had suspected, but never demanded proof, preferring to believe the lie rather than face the truth about his wife's infidelity. Your mother, Linda. She knew the whole time, Daniel explained gently. From what you've told me about your childhood, it sounds like Robert suspected, too. That would explain why they treated you differently from Eva, who was definitely Robert's biological daughter. The pieces clicked into place. I wasn't adopted. I was the product of an affair that Linda had covered up for 26 years. Robert had raised me knowing I might not be a son, which explained the emotional distance and resentment. Eva was their real child, which explained the preferential treatment. I thought that was the end of it. But my old family wasn't done. A month later, I discovered they'd open a credit card in my name and run up $12,000 in charges, all for Eva's latest shopping spree. When I called the bank, they said the application and signatures were legitimate. According to their records. That was the final straw. I hired a private investigator to dig deeper. What he found shocked even my lawyer. My parents had been using my personal information for financial fraud since I turned 18. Multiple credit cards opened without my knowledge, each maxed out and settled for reduced amounts, systematically destroying my credit score for years. The investigator, Marcus, was thorough in a way that both impressed and terrified me. He laid out documents across his desk like he was solving a murder case: bank statements, credit applications, even old utility bills that had somehow been tied to my social security number from addresses. I'd never lived that the pattern was methodical, calculating. They hadn't just stolen from me once. They had been systematically draining my financial future for nearly 8 years. The first card was opened 4 months after my 18th birthday, a Visa with a $3,000 limit that was maxed out within 2 months. The purchases a down payment on Eva's first car. Clothing from expensive boutiques and restaurant charges that lined up perfectly with family celebrations. I wasn't even invited to. When the bill came, they let it default. Then negotiated a settlement for 40 cents on the dollar using a fake address in Florida. The second card came 18 months later. This time they were bolder. A $7,500 credit line that funded what the investigator discovered was Eva's European vacation and shopping addiction. The charges showed payments to luxury boutiques, spa treatments, and a month-long trip to Italy that cost more than I made in 4 months. All of it funded by credit that was destroying my financial standing while I was struggling to afford basic necessities in my dorm room. But the third card was the most devastating. Opened when I was 21. It had a $15,000 limit and was used for something that made my stomach turn. Cosmetic procedures for Linda. A full facelift, breast augmentation, and extensive dental work. She had literally rebuilt her appearance using my stolen identity while I was working multiple part-time jobs just to keep up with my legitimate student loan payments. Marcus showed me the timeline he'd constructed. Every major purchase, every default, every settlement, all carefully orchestrated to happen when I was too busy with college or work to monitor my credit. They had even been smart enough to use my childhood address for the billing, knowing the mail would come directly to them. Your parents are career criminals, Marcus said, his voice grim. This isn't desperation or addiction. This is systematic financial abuse spanning nearly a decade. The worst part wasn't even the money. It was the realization that every time I'd been rejected for an apartment, every time a loan application was denied, every time I wondered why my financial life felt so much harder than my peers, it was because my own family was sabotaging me from the shadows. The stress I had attributed to being a young adult trying to make it on my own had actually been the result of deliberate, calculated theft. Marcus had also discovered something else that chilled me to the bone. My parents had been monitoring my credit report through a service that sent them alerts every time my credit was checked. They knew exactly when I was applying for jobs, apartments, or loans. They could track every financial move I made. It explains so much how they always seemed to know when I got a raise, when I was saving money, when I was making progress. They had been watching me like predators, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The documentation was overwhelming, forged signatures that were sophisticated enough to fool initial screening, but different enough that a handwriting expert could identify them as fraudulent fake addresses that, when cross-referenced with public records, showed no history of me ever living their employment verification forms, claiming I worked at businesses that had never heard of me. It was an elaborate web of lies that had somehow held together for years. But Marcus wasn't done. He had also traced the money. The settlements they had negotiated on the defaulted cards hadn't come from their own legitimate accounts. They had used money from life insurance payouts after Robert's mother died when I was 19. Money that should have been partially mine as their supposed grandson. Even their method of cleaning up the fraud was itself fraudulent. The investigator had also uncovered evidence of something even more sinister. My parents had been building a case against my mental fitness for over 2 years, not just the recent months. The false claims in the court petition weren't hastily created. They were part of a carefully constructed paper trail, fake counseling records, fabricated incident reports, even staged photographs meant to show me in compromising situations. They had been planning to take control of my finances for years. They've been playing a very long game, Marcus explained, showing me timestamps on digital files that proved the documents had been created and modified over time. This wasn't a desperate grab for money for your sister. This was a systematic plan to eventually gain permanent control of your income. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Everything I had attributed to family dysfunction had actually been part of a calculated scheme. The emotional distance, the preferential treatment of EVA, the constant criticism of my life choices. It had all been designed to build a narrative that I was unstable and incapable of managing my own life. They hadn't just been bad parents. They had been con artists preparing for the ultimate score. But Marcus had found something else that gave me hope in their eagerness to build their false case. My parents had made critical mistakes. The forged documents contained inconsistencies that not only proved they were fake, but also provided evidence of when and how they were created. Computer metadata showed that the files had been edited on Robert's laptop with timestamps that coincided with family gatherings I had attended. The fake financial counselor whose signature they had forged. He had moved to another state 18 months before the supposed sessions took place. The scope of their deception was breathtaking, but so was the evidence against them. Marcus assured me that we had more than enough documentation to not only clear my name, but to pursue serious criminal charges. The paper trail was so extensive that it would be impossible for them to claim ignorance or accident. Every action had been deliberate, documented, and devastating to my life. But the investigator found something else that made my blood run cold. They'd taken out a life insurance policy on me when I was 19. Listing themselves as beneficiaries, the policy was worth $300,000. And according to the records, they'd been making inquiries about the claims process just 4 months before filing their court petition. The implications were terrifying. The timing of their financial oversight petition, combined with their recent inquiries about life insurance claims procedures, painted a disturbing picture. While we couldn't prove intent to harm me, the pattern suggested they had been researching how to benefit from my death while simultaneously working to gain legal control over my finances. This changes everything. My lawyer said when Marcus presented the life insurance discovery, we're not just dealing with identity theft anymore. This suggests a level of premeditation that could constitute conspiracy and potentially attempted guardianship fraud. The revelation forced me to reconsider every interaction I'd had with my parents over the past year. The sudden interest in my work schedule, the questions about my living situation, the attempts to isolate me from friends and colleagues. It all took on a sinister new meaning when viewed through the lens of people who stood to benefit financially from gaining control over my life or death. I found myself looking over my shoulder, constantly checking my car for tampering, avoiding predictable routines. The paranoia was exhausting, but Marcus assured me it was justified given the evidence. He recommended I install security cameras at my apartment and vary my travel routes. The possibility that my parents might escalate beyond financial fraud was real enough that we contacted local police to document the threats. The life insurance policy also provided crucial evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy. The fact that they had made recent inquiries about claims procedures while simultaneously pursuing legal control over my affairs demonstrated clear premeditation and planning. It wasn't just opportunistic theft. It was a systematic attempt to position themselves to benefit from my misfortune. We filed comprehensive criminal charges. Identity theft, wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, and attempted guardianship fraud. The evidence was overwhelming. Forged signatures, fraudulent applications, a paper trail of systematic financial abuse spanning 8 years. When the prosecutor saw the life insurance policy with its suspicious timing, additional federal charges were added. The federal case moved quickly once the evidence was presented. My parents had no defense against the mountain of documentation. Their expensive lawyers couldn't explain away forged signatures, fraudulent applications, or the suspicious life insurance inquiries. The judge sentenced Robert to 4 years in federal prison and Linda to 3 years with orders for full restitution plus penalties. Iva was charged separately for her role in the most recent credit card fraud and conspiracy. She initially tried to claim ignorance, but phone records and text messages proved she had been an active participant in planning and executing the fraud. She plead bargained down to 18 months probation in exchange for testimony about her parents' other crimes and a full admission of her role in the schemes. But the legal victory was just the beginning of a much longer process. The restitution was structured over 7 years with monthly payments that seemed almost insultingly small compared to the damage they had caused. The court ordered them to pay $1,200 a month to repay the fraudulent debts, plus interest $500 a month for credit repair and legal fees and additional payments for the therapy I now needed to process the trauma. The psychological impact was something I hadn't anticipated. Even with Daniel in my life and my career thriving, I found myself struggling with trust issues that ran deeper than I had realized. Every new relationship, every workplace interaction, every financial decision was colored by the knowledge that the people who were supposed to protect me had instead systematically exploited me for nearly a decade. I started seeing a therapist, a real one this time, not the fictional one my parents had invented for their court documents. Dr. Sarah Chan specialized in family trauma and financial abuse, 2 areas I never knew existed as professional specialties until I needed them. Our sessions were painful, but necessary, slowly unpacking decades of manipulation and gaslighting that I had normalized as typical family dynamics. What you experienced, Dr. Chen explained during one particularly difficult session, is complex trauma combined with financial abuse. Your parents didn't just steal money from you. They stole your ability to trust your own perceptions and destroyed your sense of financial security. That's going to take time to rebuild. She was right. I found myself second-guessing decisions I would have made confidently before when my company offered me a promotion to senior software architect with a significant salary increase. My first instinct wasn't excitement. It was fear about who might try to exploit it. When I started dating someone new, I caught myself monitoring my bank statements, obsessively looking for any signs of unauthorized activity. The paranoia was exhausting, but Dr. Chen helped me understand that it was a normal response to betrayal trauma. She taught me techniques for managing the anxiety, ways to rebuild my sense of security. Gradually, and most importantly, how to recognize the difference between reasonable caution and trauma-induced hypervigilance. Meanwhile, the legal aftermath continued to unfold in ways I hadn't expected. The private investigator, Marcus, had uncovered evidence that my parents' financial crimes extended beyond just my identity. They had been running similar schemes on other vulnerable people, including Robert's elderly father, who lived in assisted living. His social security benefits had been redirected to an account controlled by Robert and Linda for over 18 months before facility staff noticed. The discovery led to additional federal charges and an investigation that revealed a pattern of financial elder abuse affecting several victims in their social circle. What I had thought was a targeted attack on me personally turned out to be part of a much larger criminal operation. My parents weren't just dysfunctional family members. They were career criminals who had been operating under the cover of respectability for years. The expanded federal case brought new revelations about the extent of their criminal enterprise. Financial records show that over the past decade, they had stolen nearly $180,000 from various victims using identity theft, forged documents, and exploitation of vulnerable adults. The money had funded Eva's designer shopping addiction, luxury vacations to exotic destinations, expensive cosmetic procedures, and even investments in rental properties that they couldn't have afforded on their legitimate income. Eva's role in the criminal enterprise was more extensive than I had initially realized. Court documents reveal that she hadn't just been a passive beneficiary of the stolen money. She had been an active participant in several of the fraudulent activities. She had forged signatures, created fake documents, and even impersonated other people in phone calls to banks and credit agencies. The innocent younger sister act had been carefully constructed deception. The revelation about Eva was particularly devastating because I had held on to some hope that she might have been manipulated or coerced by her parents. Learning that she had been a willing and active participant in the systematic destruction of my financial life felt like losing my family all over again. The plea bargain she had negotiated wasn't motivated by guilt or genuine remorse. It was a calculated decision to minimize her own legal consequences while providing enough cooperation to satisfy prosecutors. But perhaps the most shocking discovery came when Marcus traced the source of the initial funding for my parents' criminal lifestyle. The money they had used to establish their fraudulent operation had come from insurance fraud they had committed years earlier. They had staged a burglary at their home when I was 16, claiming valuable items had been stolen that they had actually sold privately through online marketplaces. The insurance payout had been the seed money for everything that followed. The insurance fraud discovery also provided the missing piece of the federal case puzzle. The prosecutor was able to use it as evidence of a long-running criminal conspiracy, elevating all charges to felony levels that carried significant prison time. Their expensive defense attorneys couldn't explain away a pattern of insurance fraud, identity theft, and financial exploitation spanning over a decade. When the enhanced federal charges were announced, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the original court case. A sense of true justice being served. The initial state charges had felt inadequate compared to the magnitude of their crimes. The federal charges, with sentences of 4 to 6 years each, felt proportionate to the damage they had caused, not just to me, but to other victims. Their social circle evaporated overnight. The church asked them not to return after the criminal charges became public. Their neighbors, who had provided character witness testimony about my supposed instability, publicly apologized and expressed shock at the extent of the deception. The people who had known me as a troubled young man suddenly realized they had been manipulated and lied to for years. And me. I started over completely illegally, changed my last name to Keating, honoring my biological father. I bought a small condo using my cleaned-up credit score. I got promoted at work based on my actual merit, not family drama or manipulation. And I began building a real relationship with Daniel. Slowly, carefully. But genuinely. He came to my 27th birthday dinner. The first birthday celebration I had ever truly enjoyed without underlying tension or manipulation. He cried when I called him Dad without hesitation. He told me he couldn't undo the lost years, but he was grateful for the chance to know the man I had become, despite everything I had endured. 6 months later, I got a message from Eva asking for forgiveness and help with her legal fees. I deleted it without reading past the subject line, but Eva's message haunted me more than I expected. Not because I felt guilty about deleting it, but because of how perfectly it represented the manipulation tactics I had spent months learning to recognize in therapy. Dr. Chen and I spent an entire session analyzing what little I had glimpsed before deleting the message, and she helped me understand how even attempted contact was part of a continued pattern of manipulation. The timing isn't coincidental, Dr. Chen explained. She's not reaching out because she's genuinely remorseful or because she misses having a relationship with you. She's reaching out because her legal situation is precarious and she's looking for any possible advantage. Your forgiveness, your silence, or your financial support. The realization that even Eva's attempted apology was strategically manipulative helped solidify something important for me. Cutting contact hadn't been cruel or unreasonable. It had been necessary. Self-protection. The family I had grown up with hadn't just been dysfunctional. They had been predatory. Every interaction had been transactional. Every emotion had been weaponized and every relationship had been structured around what they could extract from me. For months after Eva's blocked message, I received another communication that I almost ignored. It was a certified letter from a law firm I didn't recognize, and my first instinct was to assume it was another attempt by my former family to cause problems. But when I opened it, I discovered something unexpected. It was notification that I had been named as a beneficiary in the estate of Robert's elderly father, the same man whose benefits my parents had been stealing. According to the letter, the grandfather had died 6 weeks earlier, and his will specifically mentioned me by name, leaving me a modest inheritance of $25,000, along with a personal letter he had written shortly before his death. The timing seemed suspicious until I realized that he must have become aware of Robert and Linda's fraud when the federal investigation began. And I'd taken steps to ensure that at least some of his assets would reach their intended destination. The personal letter was heartbreaking, written in shaky handwriting that spoke to his advanced age and failing health. It apologized for not reaching out to me directly and expressed regret that he had allowed Robert and Linda to control communications with their extended family. He had wanted to maintain a relationship with me, but had been told repeatedly that I was troubled and didn't want contact with family. I always wondered why such a smart, hard-working young man would cut off his family, he wrote. Now, I understand that you didn't cut us off. You were cut off from us. I'm sorry. I believed their lives for so long. I'm sorry I didn't try harder to reach you directly. I hope this small gift can help you build the life you deserve free from their influence and manipulation. The letter was signed with a shaky but determined signature and included a piece that brought tears to my eyes. Your real father called me after the truth came out. He seems like a good man. I'm glad you found each other. And I'm proud of the man you've become, despite everything they put you through. The discovery that my biological father had reached out to extended family members on my behalf was touching, but also revealed another layer of Robert and Linda's deception. They hadn't just isolated me from potential sources of emotional support. They had actively worked to prevent anyone from discovering their lies by controlling all family communications and spreading false narratives about my character and mental state. The grandfather's inheritance also provided something unexpected closure about the family I had lost. His letter made it clear that there had been other relatives who would have welcomed a relationship with me if they had known the truth about my situation. The isolation I had felt wasn't because I was inherently problematic or because there was something wrong with me. It was because my parents had systematically prevented me from forming connections that might have exposed their deception. I used part of the inheritance to create a small emergency fund that I kept separate from my regular accounts, something Dr. Chen had suggested as a way to rebuild my sense of financial security. But I also used some of the money for something more meaningful. I hired a genealogist to help me map out my biological family on Daniel's side and potentially connect with relatives who might be interested in meeting me. The genealogist, Patricia, was enthusiastic about the project in a way that surprised me. She explained that she specialized in cases involving family separation and what she called genealogical mystery situations, where family histories had been disrupted by deception, abandoned or other traumatic circumstances. Your case is actually more common than you might think. Patricia explained during our initial consultation. Family structures are more complex than most people realize, and there are thousands of people searching for biological relatives' lost connections, or simply trying to understand their true family history after discovering deception. Within 8 weeks, Patricia had constructed a detailed family tree that revealed I had dozens of relatives I've never known existed. Daniel had 3 siblings and numerous cousins, all of whom had children and grandchildren. There were cousins my age who lived within driving distance, aunts and uncles who remembered Daniel mentioning a brief relationship years ago, and even elderly great-aunts who were still alive and eager to meet their previously unknown great-nephew. The first family gathering I attended was overwhelming in the best possible way. Daniel's sister hosted a barbecue at her home in New Hampshire, and I found myself surrounded by people who shared my facial features, my mannerisms, even my tendency to gesture emphatically when explaining technical concepts. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere without having to prove my worth or justify my existence. Daniel's brother, Uncle Mike, was a systems administrator who shared my love of problem-solving and building elegant technical solutions. His sister and Karen worked as a project manager and had the same dry sense of humor and direct communication style that had always gotten me in trouble with my adoptive family. Their children, my cousins, ranged in age from teenagers to adults with families of their own, and they welcomed me with an enthusiasm that was both touching and healing. During that first gathering, I learned family stories that suddenly made sense of personality traits I'd always considered quirks or flaws. My tendency to hyper-focus on projects until completion wasn't a character defect. It was something that ran in the Keating family. My dry humor and tendency toward sarcasm weren't signs of disrespect or antisocial behavior. They were family traits that have been passed down through generations. Most importantly, I discovered what healthy family dynamics actually looked like. People disagreed without screaming or manipulation. Boundaries were respected without retaliation, and no one expected anyone else to fund their lifestyle choices. When someone needed help, it was offered freely, but not demanded as an obligation. When someone succeeded, it was celebrated rather than resented or exploited for personal gain. The contrast with my experience growing up was stark and painful, but also liberating. I finally understood that the dysfunction I had normalized wasn't typical family behavior. It was systematic abuse masquerading as family dynamics. The constant criticism, the financial manipulation, the emotional blackmail, none of it had been normal or acceptable. Patricia's research also uncovered something remarkable about my biological grandfather, who had died when I was 14. He had been one of the early software engineers in the computing industry working on some of the first commercial database systems in the 1970s and 80s. The career path I had chosen, which Robert and Linda had always treated as disconnected from any family influence, was actually following in the footsteps of a biological relative I had never known existed. The discovery provided a sense of connection and validation that I had never experienced. My aptitude for technology and systematic thinking wasn't random. It was part of my genetic heritage. The skills and interests that had always made me feel like an outsider. And Robert and Linda's family were actually connecting me to my true biological lineage. The truth no one tells you is that some families are just predators in disguise. Some stories don't end with reconciliation or forgiveness, and that's okay. Mine ends with freedom, justice, and the discovery that real family isn't about legal documents or biological connections. It's about people who see your value beyond what you can provide for them. They tried to steal my identity, my money, my future, and potentially my life. Now they have nothing but prison sentences and destroyed reputations. While I finally have everything I was never given growing up: peace, security, genuine relationships, and a father who actually loves me for who I am rather than what he can extract from me.